Hello, Year 11. This is Ms. Samsonite here. I've put together this revision session to help you prepare for your exam tomorrow for Elizabeth. Remember, you're just doing the first half of paper 2. I'm going to go over some of the key topics that you do need to be revising for the paper. Just to make you fully aware, though, that if you're going to just rely on this for your revision, then you're not really helping yourself here. You need to be, if you want to push yourselves to those top grades, you need to be using your revision guides as well to revise the topics in more detail. You need to be doing some practice questions and practice papers, and this has been provided for you in revision work on Teams. So I hope this is useful to you, but don't rely just on this. First of all, I'm just going to remind you of how the exam works, the format of the questions that you're going to be answering. So you'll start with a features question. You have 2 topics. You have to give a feature for each of those topics. Each developed feature is worth 2 marks, and I will show you some examples of what these features should look like in this session. Question 2 is the classic 12 marker, where you have to write 3 paragraphs addressing the focus in the question. And the last question is a 16 marker, again, a classic, how far do you agree question. You need to be debating, you need to be presenting an agree side, a disagree side, and making a judgment at the end. Unlike your paper 1, there is no SPAG on this, so there's no bonus marks. It really is based on what you know, and being able to bring your knowledge to this paper is a completely knowledge-based paper. There are no sources, no interpretations. So let's start with the structure of Elizabeth's government. You can see 5 features of Elizabeth's government on the left. There are 5 descriptions on the right. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause here and see if you can match up the roles to the descriptions. Look for the clues in the descriptions to try and match them up. In terms of Elizabeth's government, this is all you need to know in terms of the government that was in place to help her rule England. So take a moment, pause this, and then I'll give you the answers. So here are the answers. I'm not going to read through all of these because you can read through it yourself, but in terms of the features, the descriptions on the right give you all the information you basically need to know for Elizabeth's government. It's not a big topic, this. You need to have some awareness of it. It could feature in question 1, feature questions. It's not going to feature in the bigger questions, but you do need to have some awareness of it. In terms of how it would apply to the feature questions, here's an example for you. So, straightforward question, describe 1 feature of Elizabeth's government. A reminder, you're going to have 2 separate topics and you have to give a feature for each. This is a recent change in the format of the exam, which is beneficial for you. Here's the example. So here's the feature. 1 feature is the Privy Council. It is totally fine to just say, use the name of one of the features of government. That is a completely valid feature. A feature is anything that is relevant to the topic of the question, and the Privy Council is definitely relevant. You need to then provide, to get the extra mark, a detail to develop the feature. You will not get the extra mark if you're not developing the feature you've given. And here's the development. It advised Elizabeth on important matters. That might seem really basic, but that's completely correct, and that would get a mark. So being able to learn these features and at least 1 detail about them is all you really need to do in terms of revising Elizabethan government. Let's have a look at society. Again, it's a topic you need to have awareness of. It underpins the whole course, but it's not going to feature in a bigger question. You need to have awareness of it, though, for the smaller features question. On the screen, you can see 6 social groups, the main social groups in England. I would like you to pause this, and I would like you to think about what is the correct order for these social groups from top to bottom in order of importance. So pause, have a go at this, and then we'll go through the answers. Here are the answers. Yeoman's missing an N on the end there. There should be an N on the end of yeoman. Nobility, after Elizabeth, are the most powerful people in the country. They own lots of land. Gentry are sort of lower nobility. They don't have titles like earls and dukes, but they do own some land. Yeomen are small landowners who work almost like kind of medium-sized farmers. The deciding factor in the social structure here is land. The further down you go, the less land people own. Tenant farmers rent land, and the bottom 2 groups obviously own no land whatsoever. Something to bear in mind here is that this essentially applies for 90% of the population that lived in England. So 90% of the population of England apply to this structure. The other 10% lived in towns, and at the top of society in towns are merchants, essentially. So people who bought and sold things, they are the people at the top of society in towns. So we move on to the first big topic within Elizabeth, which is looking at the problems or the challenges that she faced when she became queen in 1558. For your revision, you should be aware of at least 4 problems. I'm going to go through 5. These are the most important problems that she had to deal with. Starting first of all with the fact that, starting first of all with financial weaknesses. As you can see there, Elizabeth was left with a debt of £300,000, which in Elizabethan time is a significant amount of debt. This is a massive issue for Elizabeth because, as you're going to see in a moment, there's a significant threat of invasion from France. How is Elizabeth going to pay for defences when the country is in significant debt? And this probably explains her decisions in terms of how to deal with France. Next, you have religion. Potentially, I would argue, definitely Elizabeth's greatest problem. It links into all the others, which I'll kind of explain as we go on. The country was deeply divided. She's got to somehow find a way to get the majority of the country to support her when she knows that more than half the country are Catholics and don't believe that she should be queen. So the question is how is she going to do that when you've got the issue of religion at stake, where, again, in Tudor times, everyone believes in God. There's no question of that. And how people worship God is very important to them. It's a matter of life and death. So this is a massive issue that Elizabeth has to overcome. Next, you have the threat of invasion. At this time, Spain is not a massive issue because Philip II of Spain is hoping that Elizabeth is going to marry him. So he's not really putting any pressure on England at this time. The threat is really coming from France alongside Scotland, because France and Scotland had an historic alliance called the Old Alliance that is made stronger by the fact that Mary, Queen of Scots, her mother is French. She's married to the heir to the French throne, and to provide protection to Mary's mother, who's running the country, running Scotland, while Mary is living in France with her husband. There are French soldiers stationed in Scotland, which could essentially cross the border and invade England any time. And so Elizabeth has to make a big decision in terms of what she is going to do in terms of France. Technically, England and France are still at war because Mary was engaged with war with France. Elizabeth has to decide, is she going to continue that war or is she going to seek peace? Ultimately, she seeks peace, and she does it very quickly, which shows that this was a massive problem from her point of view that she needed to overcome. And probably the fact that she was in huge debt, so couldn't pay for defences, probably contributed towards her making that decision. Not as serious a problem, but it's putting pressure on Elizabeth in the long term, is the issue over gender and marriage. Mary was the first Queen of England. She was an unsuccessful monarch. Regardless of her gender, she was just a very poor queen. This therefore reflected badly on Elizabeth because people just assumed that this had Mary's reign had proven that women can't rule. Elizabeth has to overcome those prejudices at the time. There is also the expectation that she should marry, that she should find a suitable foreign member of royalty that she can marry and provide an heir. It's seen as a duty that she should be providing an heir to carry on the Tudor name. As she goes on, as we know, she doesn't marry, she doesn't have children, and so what happens is that this does create uncertainty, instability in terms of, well, who is Elizabeth's heir, who's going to replace her if she dies. Lastly, you've got legitimacy. This very much links in with religion. So essentially, Catholics do not accept Elizabeth's right to be queen because she's Protestant. If you remember, her father, Henry VIII, divorced his first wife, the Catholic Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne Boleyn. To achieve that, he changed the religion of the country in the Reformation from Catholic to Protestant. So from Catholics' eyes, they view the marriage of Elizabeth's parents is completely unacceptable because of what it led to in England, and do not believe it was legitimate, and therefore do not accept Elizabeth's right to be the Queen of England. This feeds into the problem of religion. So this backs up essentially what I'm saying regarding the importance of religion. It is the biggest problem by a mile in terms of what Elizabeth has to deal with, because it links into why there's doubts over legitimacy. It partly explains why there is a threat of invasion, because part of the issue is that the threat she's facing are from Catholic powers, and England is now a Protestant country. And so religion links into a lot of the other problems. That's why it's, in my opinion, the most important. And so when it comes to, for example, writing a 16-mark question, these are the kind of questions you have to consider. What is the most important problem? And considering the links between the problems is how you're going to essentially go about doing it. So here you've got an example 16-mark question based around this topic, just to show you how what I've just talked to you through applies. A reminder, 16-mark questions require 3-point evidence, explain link paragraphs, plus a judgment. That link's really important. It's how you show that you're addressing the question, the issue of do you agree or disagree. And here's an example paragraph for you. The question is, religious divisions were the main challenge Elizabeth faced. So this is an agree paragraph. So here's the point. One reason I agree is because of the challenge from Catholics in England. Here's the evidence. You're only looking for 2 examples of evidence. And if you look here, there are 2 examples. As you can see, there's mention of the role of Mary, the first, Bloody Mary, before Elizabeth, burning 300 Protestants, stirring up religious tensions, and then also the fact that there are powerful Catholics in the north who are going to resent Elizabeth as a Protestant queen and could challenge her. Bringing it back to the issue of challenge, so how does this pose a challenge to Elizabeth? It's a challenge because it shows that Catholics are always going to be a threat to Elizabeth. Catholics are never going to see Elizabeth as the authority. They're always going to view the Pope as having greater authority, and so that potentially weakens Elizabeth's position. Now the link, and that's key because this is how you're going to say why you agree or how this is agreeing with the question. And so you don't have to write much here, it's just a developed sentence, but making it clear, as you can see here, this agrees with the statement. It demonstrates how religion posed a major challenge over half the country of Catholics, so she had to find a way for them to accept her. It's just bringing your paragraph back to, are you agreeing or disagreeing? The trick with the 16-mark questions is that for your paragraphs, if you can always start by saying whether you're agreeing or disagreeing and end that way, then it means you're fully focused on the question. You need to have the balance here. So within this question, you would then probably have a disagree paragraph where you bring in one of the other problems. So for example, legitimacy is a prompt on the screen there. You could talk about financial problems. You could talk about the threat of invasion. So you need to bring in a different problem to pose a challenge. Right, so next let's look at the religious settlement. It's quite boring, so it doesn't really stick in people's minds, but it's extremely important. It pretty much dictates the rest of what happens in the Elizabeth unit because of the decisions that Elizabeth makes. Like the threat of invasion, where she agrees peace with France within the first 3 months of her reign to show that she views it as a serious problem. The same thing with the religious settlement. She presents the settlement to Parliament within the first couple of months of the start of her reign, showing how significant this is. She knows that this is an issue she has to resolve to ensure she has a successful reign. So with the religious settlement, there are 2 main parts to it, which does make it good from a revision point of view. There isn't much you have to remember here. It's made up of 2 laws. The first law is the Act of Supremacy. Think about that word supremacy. It's talking about authority. It states that England will be a Protestant country. The head of the church in England will be Elizabeth. The key point here, if you remember, is that she doesn't call herself the head of the church, though. She calls herself the supreme governor of the church, so that it does not appear, or it doesn't sound like she's directly challenging the Pope. Remember, she's trying to get Catholics on side here, so she doesn't want to be seen putting herself up against the Pope to dissuade Catholics from supporting her. That's the first key law. The second is the Act of Uniformity, which is, again, the law that states what all churches in England must look like. Think about the word uniform. It looks the same. It outlined that the prayer book used in churches would be English. It clearly stated what churches should look like. The intention was that all churches should be Protestant churches, but have Catholic features like a crucifix, so that Catholics would want to still come to church. It would feel familiar to them. It would keep them on her side. So you've got those two laws. They are backed up by something called the Royal Injunctions. These injunctions were special orders that could be put in place to follow up if the rules are not being adhered to. If churches in certain parts of the country weren't following Elizabeth's rules, although we're going to go into looking at the opposition and challenges to Elizabeth's settlement, which is passed and becomes law in the country, don't let that fool you that everyone was against it. By and large, most people accepted it. Protestants were happy with it because it was a Protestant church. Most Catholics supported it because there were some Catholic features, but also they weren't going to be burnt at the stake if they didn't go to church. The worst that happened is that you get a fine, and the fine was significant enough. It was a week's wages, so that people went to church because they didn't want to pay a week's wages. But it's better than being burnt at the stake, as was the case under Mary. It's not so bad. So she does, it's an impossible situation. She probably does strike the right balance, though, because the majority of the country accept the settlement. However, for those that weren't following it, there was strong action straight away. So within the first year of the royal injunctions, about 400 members of the church, known as clergy, were sacked in the first visits to churches to check that Elizabeth's rules were being followed. With bishops, it's a different situation. Bishops were very much against the settlement. Bishops are church leaders, and there were 28 bishops across the whole of England. Because bishops were high up in the church, they probably felt they needed to be more loyal to their religion, to their church. So that's why they were stronger in their opposition. Either this, from their point of view, the settlement was not Catholic enough, or it was too Catholic. So 27 out of 28 bishops resign and are replaced. So that is a significant amount of bishops. So therefore, Elizabeth's subs bench, if you imagine her subs bench for bishops, is used up straight away. And that kind of explains the problems that she's going to face later on. So in terms of challenges, we'll start with the Puritans. If you remember, the Puritans are extremely strict Protestants, and because they were strict, they did not agree with any of the Catholic features that Elizabeth was allowing in her church, such as crucifixes, such as priests could wear special clothing called vestments. They were not happy about this at all. So they felt the settlement wasn't Protestant enough. They opposed the presence of crucifixes and vestments, which is religious clothing in churches, particularly with crucifixes. The word idol is important here because Puritans were all about purity in terms of you didn't really need any obstacles in the way of people's worship. All you need is God and you need people. You don't need anything in between. They believed that objects like crucifixes, so the image of Jesus dying on the cross, were objects of false worship that got in the way of people just worshipping God. And so they were it was very much against their religious viewpoint. The first challenge that Puritans posed to Elizabeth is over the issue of crucifixes. Now, remember, I told you she replaced all her bishops. So the problem she had here is that she could not afford more bishops resigning over the crucifix issues because she could not replace them because she'd already used up all her subs. And that early on in her reign could create an image of instability that could create a problem for her. So therefore, she backs down over the crucifix issues. So the Puritans win round one. She still keeps a crucifix in her own personal church, but she backs down on that issue. Later on, when she's more secure in her reign, the Puritans challenge her over the vestment issue. And as you can see on the screen, Puritan bishops end up losing their posts over this issue because members of Puritan churches were invited to London to basically have some training on how religious clothing should be worn in churches. 37 of the 110 that were invited to London for this training don't attend, and they basically lose their posts over this. So over the issue of vestments, Elizabeth took much stronger action. Thing to bear in mind here, though, is that Puritans were a small group, so they never really posed a major challenge to Elizabeth. Obviously, her biggest issue was going to be from Catholics. Quite early on, though, in her reign, she didn't really face much issues from Catholics. The Pope was pretty quiet. He was busy dealing with Protestants in Europe. He wasn't really thinking about England that much. And as I said, most Catholics grudgingly accept the settlement. Those that just can't get on board with it, a lot of them left. England in protest, so they exiled themselves. Elizabeth was concerned that Catholic powers might stir up opposition at home. So there was always the issue, the concern that for Catholics that were against the settlements, they would be more willing to respond to influence from abroad to challenge Elizabeth. And this does happen later on. Finally, in 1566, the Pope instructed English Catholics to not attend church. It's the first time the Pope directly addresses the situation in England. Worse is going to come. If you remember the word recusant, recusant was the word for the people who refused to go to church in England under Elizabeth, and they were largely Catholic. And again, if they didn't go, they had to pay a fine. So recusants tended to be wealthier Catholics because they could afford the fine. How this works in terms of, I'll give you another example, a features question, a question 1. So we've got here, describe one feature of the Puritan opposition to the religious settlement. So for a moment, just think to yourself, what was one of the issues that Puritans challenged Elizabeth on? Can you remember one of them? So one of them was crucifixes, remember? So one feature is that Puritans opposed the presence of crucifixes in churches. That would be worth 1 mark. Remember, we have to develop that feature. We have to add some sort of detail. So a good example here would be why they challenged it or what the outcome of that challenge was. In this case, my development I'm using here is that the reason why. So this is because they viewed crucifixes as idols, but it'd be completely valid to also say that Elizabeth had to back down over this issue because you couldn't replace any bishops at the time who might resign, or that Elizabeth backed down, but she still kept a crucifix in her own private chapel. When looking at the challenges to Elizabeth's religious settlement, you do need to be aware of the backdrop in Europe, what's happening in Europe at the time, in particular, the Dutch revolt. Now, students do struggle with the Netherlands in the Elizabeth unit because I think it seems quite complicated. It goes on for about 20 years, and there's like quite a few terms that maybe don't stick in students' heads, but it's not as tricky as it seems. I'll try and kind of explain that to you. So if you remember, well, the Netherlands is controlled by Spain at this time. Its location is important because, as you can see, it's very close to England, and it's very easy to cross over from the Netherlands to England without too much trouble. So in 1566, there is an outbreak of a revolt in the Spanish Netherlands against Spanish control. The rebels are mainly Protestants and were influenced by Protestant ideas. There were some Catholics as well that were part of the rebels who didn't want to be controlled by Spain. So the Dutch revolt starts from 1566. This puts pressure on Elizabeth because she is the only prominent Protestant monarch in Europe. So she is sort of expected to provide support to these Protestant rebels against Spain. There's a great deal of pressure from her Privy Council to do this. She does not want to do this because she does not want to provoke a war with Spain. What she would like to do, though, is indirectly help the Dutch rebels, because the longer they're fighting with Spain, the less likely Spain are going to bother England, and also it would kind of run down Spanish resources. So essentially, for about 20 years, Elizabeth is indirectly helping the Dutch against the Spanish. And that's basically the main thing you need to know. From a revision point of view, it's useful to know that there are 3 kind of key things that Elizabeth does. So if you can learn these 3 things, that's really beneficial for you. The first indirect support she provides to the Dutch is in the form of sea beggars. So sea beggars are Dutch pirates who attacked and raided Spanish ships. Elizabeth allowed them to dock in England so they could restock, go out and attack Spanish ships. But she also allowed Spanish ships to dock in England. So it sort of looked like that she wasn't taking sides. The Genoese loan is one of my favorites. So the Genoese loan involves the fact that even though Spanish, Spain are getting all these resources from the New World, from the Americas, lots of gold, and are very wealthy, it's still very expensive to fund a military campaign. And they were running low on funds a few years into dealing with the Dutch revolt. And so they secure a loan from an Italian bank in specifically the area of Genoa. That's why it's the Genoese loan. Gold was being transported on ships to the Netherlands. They stopped briefly in England, so they were docked in England. During that time, Elizabeth essentially seized the gold for herself. When questioned by Philip, she essentially said, well, it wasn't your money anyway, which is obviously going to annoy Philip. It isn't enough to provoke him to go to war with her, but again, it shows she's trying to just make things a bit awkward to help the Dutch without getting directly involved. Again, another reason why she's wary of doing this is she doesn't want to encourage Catholics at home to then challenge her by showing that she's clearly kind of taking sides in this. The third key point skips forward a few years here. In 1576, again, you have a situation where the Spanish are unable to kind of keep funding their soldiers, and the soldiers, angry and frustrated, hungry and wanting to be paid, go on the rampage in the Netherlands, and in particular in the city of Antwerp. The Spanish go on a rampage, they pillage, they burn down, they rape, they completely destroy the city of Antwerp. Shocks the Protestant rebels, but also Dutch Catholics as well. Protestants and Catholics in the Netherlands come together and in reaction produce a list of demands, and it's known as the Pacification of Ghent. The key demand is they want the Spanish to leave, and they demand that the Spanish leave, and the Spanish do leave, but they were never going to stay away. 6 months later, they come back. This time, Philip sends an army under the Duke of Parma to seize back control of the Netherlands. In support of the Dutch during this time, Elizabeth provides a loan of £100,000 to the Dutch rebels. So again, an example of how she won't get involved directly, but she'll provide some sort of like sneaky support to the Dutch to keep them going. And so this background here is important in explaining again why Elizabeth is treading very carefully in terms of how she's dealing with Catholics. And the Dutch revolt, as you know, is going to come back later on. But this is essentially the situation for about 20 years. So we end Unit 1 with the Mary Queen of Scots dilemma. 10 years into Elizabeth's reign, Mary Queen of Scots turns up in England dramatically. We mentioned her previously. She is the closest relative to Elizabeth. She is the heir to the English throne if anything was to happen to Elizabeth. But Elizabeth is very reluctant to name her this because of her religion. She doesn't really trust Mary. If you remember, by the time Mary gets to her third marriage, there is this huge scandal because she married the chief suspect in the murder of her second husband. This turns most of Scotland against her. Scotland is taken over by Protestant lords, explaining why she comes to England. She loses a battle with those lords. She ends up in prison. She manages to escape and then gets a boat to England and arrives in 1568. Elizabeth is faced with a dilemma of what does she do with Mary? There are three options. She could just get Mary straight out of the country, send her back to Scotland or France. She could imprison Mary in England, or she could just execute Mary, which would be pretty harsh. On the screen are the pros and cons of each of these, which you can read for yourselves. Before I go through it, can you remember which option she picks? Now, if you went with the second option, then well done, because that is exactly what she does. She keeps Mary under house arrest in England for 19 years. It's probably the best of a bad bunch of options. She can keep an eye on Mary because, you know, Mary is a threat to her because she is Catholic. She has a son in Scotland, so she has an heir. So lots of reasons why Mary is a threat to Elizabeth. But the issue is that while Mary is in England, she is ready to go. If you can just get her out from house arrest, Catholic replacement for Elizabeth. So she is an inspiration to Catholics who want to oppose Elizabeth. And very early on, very soon after Mary is placed under house arrest, Elizabeth has to face challenges to her authority that centre around Mary, Queen of Scots. Amazingly, they never met face to face, even with Mary being under house arrest in England for 19 years, which is kind of incredible. The theory goes is that Elizabeth was wary of Mary's apparently natural charisma. She was known to be very charming, and Elizabeth was concerned that, well, basically that she didn't want to like Mary, and then it would put her in a difficult situation about what to do about her. So she never meets her face to face. So this ends Unit 1. Unit 2 now begins with the problems that emerge from Mary being in England.